Okay, good morning. As promised, I am going to, without preparation, give the lecture that you all have prepared for me. Uh, and I may riff and I may correct. And I can't see myself because I'm looking at the PDF. So here we go. So today's discussion focuses on intersectionality in colonial Latin America. In other words, how race, gender, and religion intersected under the structures of colonial Christianity. I would add that colonial Christianity, the process of the development of colonial society and change that happened in the formative era in particular, shaped things that we now call race, gender, and religion. And in particular, I think categories categories and processes and concepts that we tend to think of as racial were um, looked from our perspective, looking back, looked like things that we might now call religious. So another way of saying that is that race and religion were co-constituted, meaning that they created and shaped each other as when I'm talking about race and religion as categories of difference and power, which is what is invoked by talking about them as intersectional. So intersectionality isn't just a concept that means that these things intersected, but it is a specific concept to talk about the way that power worked, the way that power worked in hierarchical social structures. So today's discussion is going to focus on how race, gender, and religion as categories of difference in power shaped each other and were fundamental to the structures and ideas and development of colonial Christianity. So we will begin this discussion. This is a huge discussion, and we can't cover it in one lecture, but we will begin for today's focus with women under the church. So women in the church, women as they experienced the church and as they participated in religious culture and shaped it. So a concept that is helpful for thinking about this is escrúpulo. So, escrúpulo is translated in modern Spanish as simply meaning scruples. But the way that it was used, particularly in a religious context or a theological context, um, in this era, in the early modern era, in really all of um, Iberian Christendom, uh, but I'm focusing particularly right now on colonial Latin America. Escrúpulo didn't just mean what you might think of as scruples. It referred to an experience of a troubled conscience, but it also was a deeply painful one, an emotionally painful one. Sometimes people even thought about it as physically painful. And it was the result of having either said, thought, or done something that was that was a sin, that was wrong, that created a rift between you and God, or having simply heard about someone else doing something like that and having been scandalized by it. Escándalo is another concept that we need to think about in that. And all of these, the concept of escándalo, translated simply as scandal, but again, understood in this theological way, the idea that you could be hurt, that you could be troubled, affected in a harmful way by learning about something that someone else did or said or thought that was wrong in this way. The idea that that could happen grows out of an understanding, an early modern understanding of the self as being permeable, as being, the body and the spirit, uh, as being, warring and different, but also connected. Um, and uh, and the self, what we might call the self, as being not simply contained within an individual. So the idea was that if you were scandalized by something, you were impacted by something, and you developed escrúpulo, you developed you entered into, actually, the way that it was talked about in language was entró en escrúpulo, or formó escrúpulo, meaning I entered into, or this person entered into a state of escrúpulo, or I formed escrúpulo. They formed escrúpulo. So it really was talked about as a kind of a dangerous state, a spiritual dangerous state. And the reason why it was spiritually dangerous is because theologically the idea was that there was a belief that God could not be present. God could not be physically present with sin. And so where there existed sin, God was necessarily separate. Uh, and that not separate permanently, because the sacrament of confession, which required a priest, was meant to rectify this separation. Now, this differed from earlier medieval understandings of the sacrament of confession, which was primarily a sacrament meant to repair the rift in the community. It was also necessary for getting right with God in different theological ways, but it was performed in a way that was where the priest's role was as a kind of re somebody who repaired the rift created by this person's actions, not only the rift between that person and God, but the rift between that person and society. After the Council of Trent, you see confession becoming more and more of an internal sin, rather, becoming more and more of an internal individual act that caused a rift between the soul and God. However, and Foucault talks about this and talks about how this, helped us become, or forced us to become more and more of individuals, etc. But what Foucault gets a little bit wrong is the fact that, at least in this context, the self was still understood to be permeable. And so, yes, one's conscience was the site of that rift between yourself and God. And yes, sin could be very individual. It could happen in your thoughts. It could be, invisible. However, if you were experienced, if you entered into the state of escrúpulo, you yourself became separate from God, and a soul separated from God was more vulnerable to temptation by the devil, and to therefore committing more sins. And when you commit sins, or you are troubled and you end up talking to someone else to alleviate your troubled conscience, or in other various ways, you just act in a way that is, like someone acts with a guilty conscience, etc., you can spread that experience scandal. So escándalo and scrúpulo actually go together because escándalo was the method by which escrúpulo, the state of being troubled by sin, was spread to other people. And so an individual affected in this way, existing in a state of escrúpulo, distanced from God, therefore more vulnerable to the temptations of the devil and to behaviors that might also, cause other people to fall into escándalo, was therefore a kind of weak link, was dangerous for the community. This whole idea, all of these ideas are ways of talking about a kind of contagion, so that sin and scandal and escrúpulo were considered contagious, were sort of understood as something that spread. And so within this whole system, women who were thought to be closer to the body than to the spirit, which made them spiritually suspect, in the words of your colleagues here, um, women were thought to be particularly dangerous vectors of this contagion because both as being closer to the body, which was the place through which the devil most effectively tempted or affected you, a human, also uh, because of their presumed intellectual, spiritual, and physical weakness, they also were more susceptible to such temptation, um, and to incorrect behavior. And so, in particular, women who were unprotected, the notion of desamparada, mujeres desamparadas, unprotected women, was a big concern in colonial Latin America, and there were all kinds of institutions that developed. There were practices that developed in order to both provide a kind of protection and control for women who were unprotected and to regulate women's behavior. Um, and uh, there were two ways that women's dangerous tendency, women as dangerous vectors of this kind of contagion of sin, um, operated. One was women who were unprotected and who were disorderly. That was people talked the language of order, of disorderly, showed up a lot in the ways that people wrote about women, ecclesiastical authorities and ordinary people alike. And so women who were disorderly and who were disruptive in these ways and behaved in sinful ways um, could impact society by spreading scandal. And there was I want to say that this had a real material impact. The idea was that a community thus weakened like this was also a community in which colonial rule and kind of political, what we might think of as political authority and order was also deeply weakened. So this wasn't a spiritual concept that was separate from the notion of Spain holding power in the New World, and also from any kind of authority structure as being strong or weak. So, but anyways, so women could mess things up in this way by simply doing bad things, but women could also mess things up through their actual conscience. There was also an idea that virtuous women were highly escrupuloso, that they entered into escrupulo very easily. And that was, a good thing. The concept of shame, having a lot of shame, actually, was a sign of virtue. If you felt guilty easily, if you were easily scandalized and you easily entered into escrupulo, which was considered a spiritually painful state, it was a sign of your heightened virtue. And so some women, and this mapped onto racial hierarchies, were presumed to be more prone to escrúpulo, but escrúpulo was a state that could only be corrected through confession by a priest acting as a confessor. So you had to confess your escrúpulo, even if you weren't the one doing anything wrong, in order to repair that rift between you and God, because God could not be in the presence of sin. And so bad women caused problems because they were causing scandal, and sin and scandal and shame, etc., were spreading. Other people were experiencing escrúpulo. And in all of those instances, God was separate, and thus the devil was more present, and thus political authority was weakened, etc., all connected. Economic ruin might follow, etc., all those things. But if you were a good woman, then you were always entering into this state of escrúpulo, and you also were getting separated from God. And so good women required a lot of confession, required frequenting the sacraments, like frequenting confession. So there is a racial hierarchy to all of this. So within this framework, white españolas, so Español and Española were at this point, particularly by the 17th century, understood as it was understood as an ethnic category. So peninsulares were people that actually had come from the Iberian Peninsula, who had come from Spain. But españoles and españolas was a whole racial category or an ethnic category. It included peninsulares, but most of the time when people were talking about españoles and españolas, they were often talking about American-born people of supposedly pure Spanish descent. And so within this framework, Españolas, particularly those who were of legitimate birth, who had two parents who were married, who were old Christians, cristianos viejos, which meant that they had nobody in their family who had converted from either Judaism or Islam. Uh, and some other things, like they were, for women, they had remained virgins. My cat is doing something weird. Sorry. They were understood as capable of higher spiritual status. So spiritual status is a concept, the way that I use it, it's a concept that I came up with in my first book, and it's meant to try to talk about this kind of intersectional relationship between race and gender, and aspects of religion that particularly for women, are about this whole concept that I'm talking about the contagion thing. So it's a way of talking about accumulated virtue. So spiritual status for women, as I argue anyways, was made up of a public reputation for virtue and a public reputation for piety. So if you were a woman who was known to frequent the sacraments, to have close relationships with priests, to demonstrate pious behavior, and if you were a woman who, in a very culturally and historically specific way, exhibited what we would now call virtue, which the best way to talk about it is the word recogimiento, which means a kind of quality of modesty, of subservience and obedience, but also retiring, means being somewhat separate from the world. If you were a person of high status, you could actually be separate from the world, either by living in a convent or by living um, kind of secluded in a house, because you could be supported by the men in your family. If you were not a high status person, many women who are not españolas, also claimed in court cases and various other things that they too had recogimiento, but this was a reclamation of this idea. The kind of official definition of recogimiento meant literally separated from the physical world in some way, or not the physical world. I read the words physical world and it got me distracted. Literally separated from the outside world. So white Españolas were viewed as capable of higher spiritual status, while women of color were seen to be bound to the physical world. That's true. And so it was harder for poor women and non-white women to, because of most of it has to do, a lot of these things had to do with economic processes where they had to work outside the home, but also uh, theological notions of a spiritual hierarchy that simply did believe that people, women of African descent, that people of African descent, and that indigenous people were not capable of the same kind of spiritual purity. Um, so this logic of purity extended to limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, which separated cristianos viejos, old Christians, from conversos, or people of mixed or non-Christian ancestry. Okay, so that is saying a whole lot of different things. Limpieza de sangre has a long history. It starts in medieval Spain, and uh, it was fundamentally talking about people who were had no Jewish or Islamic ancestry. So cristianos viejos had limpieza de sangre. Old Christians had blood purity. As that, and there were all kinds of, and it was imagined as literal blood purity. And this is why we have to talk about religion as the kind of earliest way that racialized concepts are developed and come to the Americas. In the Iberian Peninsula, and I wrote about this in the article that I co-wrote with Kelsey Moss. So if you have read that, you know about that. But the person who studied it the most deeply and really helped us understand this is Maria Elena Martinez, who wrote a book called Genealogical Fictions, Limpieza de Sangre, Religion and Gender. No, Limpieza de Sangre. I can't remember the subtitle. But what she's tracing is the way that this concept of limpieza de sangre was initially all about what we would call religion, but that it really was understood as biological, and that religious behavior, that a tendency to act Jewish or act Muslim, a tendency toward heresy, separate from those two things, a tendency towards religious error in general, along with tendencies to act in sexually disordered ways or be dishonest or do other kinds of sinful things, was understood as genetic. They didn't understand genetics, but it was understood as physically passed down in the blood. And this also has to do with all kinds of ideas about gender and the ways that men and women were formed through the concept of humors and the ways that that mapped onto their actual blood. But it also literally, so one of the things about that whole system is that in women, blood was thought to become breast milk, and in men, blood was thought to become semen. And so, in literal form, what was in the blood was passed on in these two ways to children. Because it was passed on through breast milk, the practice of having Jewish women who were nursemaids to wealthy Christian women, or the practice of having later indigenous women or African women be nursemaids, meaning nurse, wealthy Christian Spanish women, was a big concern, because there was a worry from this perspective that those religious traits could be passed on through the blood. But that is just an example to show you sort of how literal the idea of limpieza de sangre was, and how things that we would now think of as religious, having to do with beliefs that you could choose, so you could convert to Christianity, but within this racialized notion of religion that was prevalent in the early modern era, um, the idea was you could never really fully get away from your what we would call biological tendency towards religious error or towards this religious heritage. And so the I this was mapped onto social hierarchy, and so people tried to hide their Jewish ancestry and their Muslim ancestry. Um, people in your outline here, you mentioned one could even buy old Christian status. Um, and this is true. If you had enough money, you could petition the king and through all these different measures to actually have officially, this is why that book is called Genealogical Fictions, officially in the public record, have the stain, which is the way that people talked about your ancestry that was not pure Christian, the stain of Jewish or Muslim ancestry erased from the record. The word raza, which means race, initially in early modern Spain, was in medieval Spain and in early modern Spain, was meant to refer to if you had raza, it meant you had a stain. Raza wasn't a neutral term. People had raza if they had a bad race, bad racial stain, which meant Jewish and Muslim. But all of these concepts, limpieza de sangre, Cristiano Viejo and limpieza de sangre were almost identical. They were basically the same thing. You couldn't have limpieza de sangre unless you were an old Christian in early modern Spain. And that was still true in Latin America, but limpieza de sangre becomes, over the 17th and 18th century, increasingly what we would call racialized in the modern sense, in that if you had any, not just Jewish and Muslim ancestry, but also any African ancestry or any indigenous ancestry, you also did not have limpieza de sangre, and you weren't really old Christians either, but the focus on those two things started to become a little bit more separated. And things like phenotype and skin color and things like that started to get added into the mix of the racial hierarchy. This is taking me a really long time. I'm only in your second paragraph. So it was harder to buy limpieza de sangre in Latin America in terms of those racial categories, unless you could pass as what we would call white. But people bought legitimate birth, meaning they had erased the fact that their parents weren't married. So there was this notion that, and all of this is related to the idea of public sin or public disorder and public scandal being a problem, because it's not quite as cynical as it sounds to say that you could just buy purity of blood or old Christian status or legitimate birth or whiteness even. When you understand that the notion that racial hierarchy, social hierarchy, economic hierarchy, spiritual hierarchy was supposed to map onto each other, and that from the perspective of colonial elites, white Spaniards were supposed to be on top in all of those ways. And if you have somebody who looks like they're a Spaniard, but actually has mixed ancestry, but they're powerful in colonial hierarchy, in colonial society, economically, politically, etc., it would be better for everyone from this perspective if that ancestry, if that stain was just removed, because knowing about it causes doubt, causes insecurity. It's part of that imperio mixto idea, the idea of this whole, mixed empire, this, people that don't fit into the República de Españoles and República de Indios. These people who challenge the colonial hierarchy by either being a poor Spaniard or by being a wealthy, powerful Spaniard who has mixed ancestry or who has secret Jewish or Muslim ancestry. So if you had enough money and you were recognized as having limpieza de sangre and being an old Christian and being of legitimate birth, meaning that everyone thought that's what you were, everyone assumed that that's what you were, then it made sense to allow those people to, with a lot of money, purchase from the king certificates of whiteness, of legitimacy, of limpieza de sangre, of old Christian status to wipe away any possibility of scandal that would disrupt the idea of Spanish hierarchy. So we've moved away from women, but within this whole system, white women were worrisome if they were unprotected because they could cause disruption in that social hierarchy. They could cause disorder by spreading scandal, and those things were linked. Whew! All right. So, as you say, sin was understood as contagious, a moral infection that spread through society by scandal or a scandalo. Just hearing about or witnessing sin was believed to corrupt one's soul. This anxiety especially surrounded women's bodies and sexuality. Women were seen as weak links whose impurity could spread through the social fabric. The Virgin of Guadalupe story with Juan Diego illustrates early colonial Christianity meeting indigenous cosmology. Juan Diego's vision and the bishop's skepticism represents a negotiation between faiths where indigenous believers reinterpreted Christianity through their own sacred frameworks, creating what we might call an imperio mixto, a mixed empire of spiritual exchange. Okay, I got to correct you there. The imperio mixto was a negative concept, and it was a concept that colonial elites talked about to refer to, as I said before, people who were behaving in ways that they shouldn't behave, women who acted like men, men who acted like women, um, uh, people who were not racially pure and religiously pure, uh, holding positions of power. People who lived where they weren't supposed to live, all kinds of things like that. But the Virgin of Guadalupe story, I think what you're referring to is something that maybe people might think of as syncretism, a kind of mixture of indigenous beliefs and Christianity. And spiritual exchange. This does look like a process of spiritual exchange, but Imperio Mixto is not related to that framework. The Virgin of Guadalupe story is a really complicated one, which I won't go into right now, but it was imagined and told as a story of devotion. So not just the original story of what happened, but also the devotion to the Virgin of Guadalupe was imagined as an indigenous story. However, it was popularized by Spaniards, by Españoles, and by colonial elite very late in the colonial era. And it was used to create a kind of Creole patriotism and then actually it was a nationalist project. I'm not going to go too much into that, but I do have a lecture on it, and there are notes on Carmen, and maybe I will, if I have time, record a lecture of that. But it's a complicated story. In colonial society, race, faith, and social belonging were also organized through cofradías and hermandades. Now, you all say here that those are Black and Indigenous confraternities. What's actually true is that cofradías and hermandades are was the same. They're both brotherhoods. They're both confraternities. Those are the Spanish and Portuguese word for them. Religious brotherhoods or confraternities, which actually women did participate in as well, were organizations of lay people that were organized to take care of particular shrines, to care for and to celebrate local saints that were particularly important to the community, and also to raise money to be able to provide religious rituals and rites and proper that were needed for proper burial practices, and to pay for prayers for people after they died, which was considered essential within the spiritual economy of this time, in which people praying for you helped you spend less time in purgatory and get to heaven faster. But people paid for those things. And so poor people or people who didn't have a lot of money needed to help themselves raise um, funds to do this. And so confraternities were one of the ways that that happened. Confraternities also provided funds to help women who couldn't afford dowries have dowries so that they could get married. Women who couldn't afford the dowry needed to enter into a convent, raised money for women to be able to do that. Um, so there were confraternities were not just Black and Indigenous. They were anything. They were just lay organizations associated with any parish. But in colonial Latin America, racially specific, ethnically specific confraternities began to form. And in Black fraternities became, not fraternities, confraternities, cofradías became important ways that people of African descent developed particular community structures and identities, and were, very much a part of Christian churches. And indigenous confraternities were very important in Indian towns, in indigenous towns, and in particular focused a lot on local saints. These brotherhoods pooled resources for legitimate births, pooled resources for marriage that would allow for legitimate births, funeral rites, or even to purchase the freedom of enslaved members. And that was a very important part of what Black confraternities did, forming spiritual communities of solidarity. The church's encouragement of marriage among enslaved Africans reveals the tension between African slavery and Christian ideals. Marriage was permitted, even praised, but within a narrow framework that preserved hierarchy. Yes, so Christian law was one of the ways that African that enslaved Africans could resist and seek protection from abuse, from the abuse inherent in slavery. Um, they could not protest being enslaved under Christian law, but they could protest certain kinds of treatment. So if a slave owner was demanding so much labor that it didn't allow an enslaved person to attend mass or to go to confession or to receive communion, or if an enslaved person was not allowing a married couple to live together and to have time actually to perform the duties of marriage and to cohabitate and to make sure that their children had religious education, then they could use those laws to protest. Now, whether or not it worked was another thing, and oftentimes enslaved people actually went to the Inquisition, accused themselves of blasphemy in order to get a hearing, which suggests that there wasn't a lot of resources for them to utilize Christian law because that is such a dangerous thing to do, to accuse yourself before the Inquisition. But they often did that. And what they said was, this person is abusing me so much that I denied God in the middle of this, physical violence that I was experiencing. And then they might also talk about all the ways in which the slave owner was not was going against Christian law by not allowing them to live with their spouse, by not allowing them to participate in Christian rituals, etc. Mestizaje, the intermixing of Africans, indigenous peoples, and Europeans, worried colonial authorities who feared moral and social contamination. Yes, this is part of the Imperio Mixto. The growing population, very large population of people of mixed race, developed into these really complicated in the 18th century categories that we will talk about that are part of what has come to be known as the casta system, the sistema de castas, um, and was very worrisome. um, Public religious life reflected this racial hierarchy. During Corpus Christi celebrations, Black artisans and enslaved workers crafted floats and carried sacred images in procession, performing both devotion and subordination. Their labor embodied lo barroco, the Latin American Baroque, where faith and spectacle intertwined. What lovely, elegant sentences you have written here. And there is so much to say about that. And I don't have time to say all of it, but none of it is incorrect. So I'm not going to correct it here. But I invite you all to think about and look at the ways that Corpus Christi really did embody the kind of 17th century spirit of excess, of mixture, of both power and subordination, all the things that you have said here. And this is exactly what Bourbon reformers are going to focus on when they're trying to simplify and modernize and bring more order to Latin American culture and Christianity. But in the 17th century, this was a beautiful display of lo barroco, of a kind of Latin American spirit of, I mean, this people thought it was a beautiful display, and Latin American intellectuals spoke about it, used it as an example of a kind of quintessentially, essentially Latin American spirit, something that was developing at this time, something that represented what was American about this part of the Spanish Empire. Now, here's something that you have not gotten quite right here. You say altogether these examples reveal the republics of difference, the República de Indios and República de Españoles, that structured colonial society. So what you're referring to is the two republics, the system of dos repúblicas, the República de Indios, República de Españoles. Republics of Difference is the title of Karen Grobert's book, which is actually talking about self-governance and self-governance that existed both in Spain at local levels, and the self-governance that existed and was, structured in particular ways and facilitated by the colonial system, but the self-governance of indigenous communities. So Republics of Difference is a title that talks about these kind of separate structures of local autonomy and of local rule and self-governance. So read the book. But the two republics was the way that right from the beginning and throughout the colonial period, the colonial system was imagined to be structured so that there were separate laws for indigenous people and Spaniards. There were separate court systems and supposedly separate living spaces as well. There was two republics. They were both under the King of Spain, but it was the Republic of Indios and the Republic of Spaniards. So that's what that is talking about. Women, indigenous people, and Africans navigated these republics with a racial and spiritual order that simultaneously constrained and empowered them. Figures like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz and Santa Rosa de Lima later complicated these boundaries, showing how women could claim intellectual and spiritual authority even within restrictive systems. Great start of an essay. I'm not going to correct that. There's a lot to say about that. That's correct. There's a lot of depth and nuance that you can get from reading the pieces that you obviously read and talking about it. Uh, this intersectionality in Latin America is crucial to study. After all, in the words of the great poet Willie Junior Maxwell II, 1738, I am like, hey, what's up? Hello. I know the song, but I can't actually get it right. All right, there you go. Write your paragraph. See what you can do.